so that became an important finding in our data to really point out the particular ways that different religious people are discriminated against and how identities often really overlap. And so it's hard to break apart being religious and being a racial minority. Those identities are sometimes really fused together. And just in ways that I think leaders need to think more about, to be more attentive to be more imaginative about how to help a variety of workers.
Welcome to Religion Unmuted, where we explore how religion is lived. I'm your host, Rachel Schneider, a religion scholar. Today, we're going to be talking about how religion is lived in the workplace. And this episode is going to be a bit different because I have the privilege of being joined in the studio by 3 guests. My guests are Religion Unmuted co-host Elaine Howard-Eklund, who is the director of the Boniek Institute for the Study and Advancement of Religious Tolerance at Rice University in Houston, Denise Daniels, a professor of entrepreneurship at Wheaton College in Illinois. Denise also regularly consults and provides executive coaching services and leadership development training in corporate contexts. And Chris Scheidel, an associate professor of sociology at West Virginia University. The book that the 3 of them have written, Religion in a Changing Workplace, draws on more than 15,000 surveys and 300 in-depth interviews with Americans across the country. Some of the interviews I was even privileged to conduct myself as well. And it is just a really exciting book and contribution to conversations about the issue of religion and faith in the workplace. So thank you so much for joining us here on Religion Unmuted.
Thanks so much for having us. It's kind of weird to be on the other side of the microphone, I must say, but it's such a privilege to be here with you and with Denise and with Chris, my co-authors. It's just fantastic.
It's great to be here.
Why is it important to understand how religion impacts workers and the workplace? What do you tell someone when they ask you, oh, that's an interesting topic, but, why does it need to be studied?
Work is the place where we spend a lot of our waking hours, for some of us, most of our waking hours, and faith remains incredibly important to people. But it's really a topic that scholars, I think, have not studied enough, how people bring faith to the workplace, how it motivates people in the workplace.
Let me jump in on this one.
Okay.
Yeah.
It seems to me that our general cultural, particularly in academia, our general cultural orientation has been that's something that we don't talk about. That's something that we don't engage with, and we are actually not that interested. And yet, we know that people around the world really do identify themselves as people of faith, oftentimes as a first identity. And then when they go to the workplace, they're expected to kind of leave it at the door in many cases, and they don't. And so we have a lot of data to suggest that people want to be talking about their faith in the workplace. People are viewing faith as a resource for themselves in the workplace. And I want to be clear, it's not every single person. We do have some bimodal distribution here where we have some people who say, actually don't want to talk about it, and other people who say, it's really relevant to me. I really do want to talk about it. And so we're trying to understand that range of responses and what an appropriate organizational response might be to that range as well.
Yeah, and I should say you did interviews with Muslims, Christians, Jewish people, non-religious people. So you really try to capture in this book a full range of experiences that people have and how they understand their religion or even non-religion in the workplace. And you also do this broader national survey with its representatives, so every kind of American, to really capture how everyone feels about religion in the workplace and the role of their faith in their approach to work or non-faith. So who are you hoping this work reaches, Elaine?
Yeah. So just to echo some of the stuff Denise is saying, this is just such an important topic, and I'm not just saying that because we wrote a book about it, and we're hoping people buy the book and rate it, if I may be so bold. But it is about a really important aspect of everyone's life, whether or not you're personally religious. So most of the world's population is religious. Even though non-religion is increasing in the United States, still most of the United States is religious. And so people bring their religions with them to work, whether or not workplace leaders like it, whether or not organizations want it. And I think we're hoping that this book really reaches thoughtful leaders of organizations, that it reaches people who want to help their workers flourish, essentially, by showing a nuanced and intelligent way to understand the presence of religion in the workplace that really helps everyone, both people who are religious and people who are not.
And Chris, I just want to ask, you have done a lot of research on religious discrimination in particular. So how does that issue play out for you? And why do you think that's important in terms of discussing religion in the workplace and our broader cultural conversations?
Yeah. So just to add something to what Elaine said, I mean, I think it's probably obvious to everybody, but like adults spend a huge chunk of time at work. Right?
Yeah.
And I think, even though our supervisors and managers might want us to just be entirely zoned in on whatever task is at hand, we naturally talk about other stuff, right? I mean, most workplaces, you get to know your coworkers and supervisors, and you talk about personal life, you talk about family, you talk about hobbies, interests, and things like that. So it's only natural that religion is going to be a part of that, whether or not people want it to be sometimes or not. In terms of the discrimination part, I think one of the themes that we talk about in the book is that we often use the word double-edged sword. And then in other places, we kind of talk about like the potentials of religion in the workplace and also some of the potential perils of religion in the workplace. And I think naturally, one of those perils or one of those potential downsides is that religion becomes sort of a source of harassment or discrimination or intolerance or whatever, conflict in general between people. And in a way, you can have discrimination with religious expression. So you express your religion and then become discriminated against because of that.
Yeah.
But you can also feel discriminated against because you can't express your religion, right? So it is not, some people might think, well, you can solve a discrimination problem by just kind of bottling it up. Like
not talking about it, just keeping it out of the work.
Yeah, but that doesn't actually solve the ultimate problem, because then if people feel like they need to practice their religion and it's not being accommodated
in some way,
then that can lead to feelings of discrimination as well. So.
And we're really sensitive, I think, in this book to leaders. It's really hard to be a leader, especially post-pandemic. Like workplaces have changed radically, and what people want from workplaces has changed radically. I mean, I remember this one interview that we did with a corporate leader, and he was like, I don't want to bring anything controversial into the workplace. It's like already hard enough. You've got to be ridiculous. I can't believe you're asking me to think about bringing religion into the workplace, like one of the most controversial things in our society. And so, he was really emblematic of what we found broadly, that often leaders want to essentially suppress religion out of fear that allowing people to talk about their faith at work will actually lead to more conflict. And so I hope that, we're trying to do a lot with this book. And I hope one of the things we do is really just give leaders some tools about how to be thoughtful in a way that's not scary, that will, be sensitive to the kind of things that they face as leaders and the kinds of things that people who work for them really want.
How do you see religious convictions, practices, beliefs helping workers in the workplace? What did you see in your data?
Workers who feel like they can express their faith in the workplace often say that they find their work more meaningful. They say they rely on faith to cope with stressful things in the workplace. And some managers might say, well, who cares? Essentially, like how is that good to me, or how is that good to the organization? But one of the things that our survey data also shows is that those same workers who find meaning in the workplace, who are able to cope with their work better, also are more satisfied with their jobs. They're more committed to their positions. And that can have actual, like, tangible economic benefits to an organization, right?
Yeah, they don't leave their organizations as quickly.
Or they're more loyal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not just about, I mean, to be cynical, if you want to say, well, how do you sell this to managers? Well, you can sell it to managers by saying, well, you can actually have more committed workers who are potentially more productive, right?
Yeah. So Elaine mentioned earlier that we really wrote this book for leaders in organizations who can use this data to help lead more effectively. But it's also written to people who have a faith tradition who are working in organizations, and particularly for those folks to kind of think through what are the implications of my own belief set, and how can I use those in a positive way to change systems in the organization, and not simply just be content with the ways that my religion might help me personally, but how could it be more impactful for a larger system?
Yeah. And I mean, I was thinking a lot about that when I was reading your book, because you conducted part of your research during COVID-19, during calls for racial justice in organizations more broadly in the wake of George Floyd's murder. And both of these cultural moments, I think, really reverberated across society and had real impact on the workplace. That continues to have impact on the workplace. So how did you see religion and spirituality shaping how people were responding to these types of events, how they interpreted issues of racial discrimination or other work-life stressors, and what lessons can we learn for the future, whether you're thinking about, lessons for workers themselves, lessons for organizations, for religious communities?
The pandemic, forever changed all of us, right? And it really shone a light, I think, on the kinds of inequalities that exist in our society broadly, and especially in workplaces. It's not like it necessarily, it created new inequalities too, but it certainly deepened other kinds of inequalities and, hurt people in lower paying jobs more, and jobs that were less flexible more, and people lost their jobs. And so we did see that these kind of coping mechanisms that sometimes happen through religious traditions became even more important during these horrific pandemic times. And, the whole country, some call it twinned pandemics of this horrific health pandemic, but also a kind of reckoning with racism and racial injustice that, we needed to have and sadly have not continued to focus on in some ways. And that, really came out in our data. And I'll just mention one way. We often think of people who are part of minority religious traditions in the United States, so people who are Jewish and Muslim, for example, as having the potential to experience the most religious discrimination, and that's largely true. But we also found in our data that racial minority members of majority traditions, so for example, Black Christians and Hispanic Christians, also experience discrimination in special kinds of ways, that those folks are sometimes what we call, doubly marginalized, that they're marginalized racially and they're marginalized religiously. And so if you take Black Christians, for example, so Black Americans are particularly likely to be religious. And so they are being discriminated in kind of almost specialized ways in workplaces. And so that became an important finding in our data to really point out the particular ways that different religious people are discriminated against and how identities often really overlap. And so it's hard to break apart being religious and being a racial minority. Those identities are sometimes really fused together, and just in ways that I think leaders need to think more about, to be more attentive to be more imaginative about how to help a variety of workers.
I think one of the positive things that we found out of this data that resulted from the pandemic particularly was the percentage of people who said that their faith communities were supportive of the challenges that they were experiencing at work. And we found almost half of our respondents who ever attended services. So anybody who said anything other than never when we asked about frequency of religious attendance, about half of those folks said that their faith communities were supportive of the needs that they had in the workplace throughout the pandemic. And I think that's a really remarkable statistic. It also suggests that there are support mechanisms outside of the workplace that are useful to people in the workplace. And I think that workplaces are not attentive to or attuned to that as much as they could or should be.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that you show really compellingly in the book is the way, again, like practices like prayer, being able to have meaningful conversations with your coworkers about areas of the deepest meaning in your own life are really important for fostering a sense of authenticity at work and fostering a sense of being able to bring your whole self to work. And I think that relates to some extent to broader conversations that we've been seeing more intensely, even though it's become more contested too, about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. So you talk about religion as the missing dimension of diversity in the workplace. Can you just share more with us about how you're thinking about that and why it's important to include religion in these conversations about inclusion and belonging in the workplace?
I think one thing that's really interesting is that it was not unusual for individuals that we interviewed to be surprised, for instance, that religion was what we call a protected class, that it was like it's in the same grouping as sort of race and gender and so forth, right? Like that we generally found kind of a lack of awareness that religion is a relevant, even among interview subjects, that religion is kind of a relevant conversation about diversity in the workplace. And I think you see that as well in the scholarly literature as well, that like just in the topic of discrimination, for instance, if you stacked everything up about, racial discrimination in the workplace or gender discrimination in the workplace, it would be huge. It'd be a huge pile. And then if you say, well, okay, what's the literature on religion discrimination in the workplace? It would be a relatively small stack. And so I think that's kind of the spirit of that idea that this is the missing dimension of workplace research.
Yeah, and to kind of put a finer point on that, organizations are required by U.S. law to provide reasonable accommodation in the workplace for religious practice, believe it or not. And I think a lot of organizations don't know this or aren't doing it in a way that their employees are kind of aware of. So one of the questions we asked folks was, does your workplace provide accommodation that allows people to practice their religion? And particularly with our minority religions, and so I'm thinking specifically of Muslim, Hindu, and Jewish practice, the percentages of folks who disagreed with that, they said, my workplace does not provide accommodation, was quite high. In the case of Muslims, it was over 50% of respondents who said that they disagreed with that statement.
And it's something that really, I just want to to make sure and underscore the point that religious discrimination relates to other forms of discrimination. So it's not like racial discrimination and gender discrimination and sexuality discrimination are like these silos and we ought to have these different programs about them. There are particular needs that folks from different kinds of minority groups face, but these things overlap very powerfully, that depending on the kinds of symbols that you wear, for example, gender discrimination and religious discrimination can be very fused. Depending on the ethnic or racial group that you're from, racial discrimination and religious discrimination can be very fused.
Yeah. One of the things that I want to really underscore is the title of your book, A Changing Workplace. So we know that workplaces are becoming more diverse. In many ways, workplaces are the place where people are likely to most encounter people who are different from them. I mean, that's certainly not necessarily true in every workplace, but, it's the place where we interact with people of all different types. Tell me a little bit more about what you hope workplaces of the future will look like in light of your research.
I know I don't want to use research as a blunt instrument in response to every question, but I do think leaders need to do a little bit more of their own research to find out, what religious demographics, so what types of people are likely to be in their organization and in their region of the country. So we know, for example, in the southern United States, evangelical Christians are overrepresented, but in the northwestern, part of the United States, evangelical Christians are very underrepresented, for example. So what religious accommodation might mean in different places in the country is really going to differ. And what religious accommodation might mean in different industries is really going to differ. So I want our leaders to do a little bit of research. I also want them to think more about religious accommodation and what it means to comply with the law, but also going above and beyond the law to really have an imaginative, thoughtful approach to what it means to essentially sponsor flourishing for everyone in the entirety of their identities, and that includes their religious identity, and really provide opportunities for thoughtful discussion and appropriate thoughtful practice in workplaces.
Yeah, I like the setup to your question, Rachel, because the three of us were actually talking right before this podcast about the idea that the workplace is one of the few places where people from different religious orientations and identities mix. And again, not in every single workplace, but generally speaking,
That's right.
it is less homogenous than lots of other contexts in our work, in our daily lives. And so that gives a great opportunity, but there's also kind of challenges. And I think historically, the way that we've tended to approach that is to say, we're just not going to talk about religion because we don't want to create conflict. And our sense on that, and kind of supported by the data that we've collected, is that's not the right approach. That the right approach is actually to allow for more conversation. And that doesn't mean that you prioritize one religion over another. That doesn't mean that you necessarily support people of faith over people who don't believe. But it is opening this opportunity for what we call a faith-friendly workplace, which is friendly to people of faith and people who don't have a faith.
That's right.
And allows for the range of human expression in that context in a way that does allow people to bring their whole selves to work.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that, we in the book we use the phrase nuanced religious accommodation, which is good, but I think I would also add like active accommodation. That I'm thinking of this one interview subject in particular who really it struck her that her employer sort of took an active approach to accommodation instead of just waiting for people to come and say, I need this accommodation. Okay, let's check this box. They were much more like upfront and vocal about what could be done. And that way it felt like she didn't have to beg for something, right?
Right.
It was like, this is here. We can do this up front. And I think that's a better approach than just kind of putting a poster on a wall and saying, and hoping that people will see it in the break room, right?
Yeah. And I was thinking a lot while reading your book. I mean, I think something that's so compelling is you just show over and over again how integral religion, spirituality, faith, however we want to talk about it, is to people's overall sense of meaning and purpose and sense of self, and what it means to express their sense of self in the workplace. And that is such an important resource that often goes unrecognized at times by organizational leaders, sometimes goes unrecognized even by religious leaders. So what would you say that religious leaders specifically, we've talked a lot about organizational leaders, but how can they help shape this conversation as well?
I do think religious leaders haven't talked enough about work. So our workplace leaders haven't talked enough about religion, and religious leaders haven't talked enough about work. So again, it's the same statistic applies to religious leaders as workplace leaders. So you have a situation where people are spending most of their time in the workplace, not in the religious organization, right? So if religious leaders care about seeing their congregants live their faith out consistently at work, then they need to start talking about work. So there's one kind of thing that I think is really important.
Well, and I think I would add is that people who have a religious identity do experience their religious organization or their faith community as providing support to them in the workplace. And we saw that with some specific data with respect to COVID. We see this with their sense of meaning in the workplace. So religious individuals are experiencing support in some sense, but they're also telling us that their religious leaders don't talk very much about it. So it's very implicit. It's a very sort of implicit experience of support that they're getting. It's not explicit from their religious communities.
As someone who's been very close to this research and been involved in these conversations with you all, that, one of the things that I'm really carrying with me that is part of a broader cultural conversation, but is about this topic of burnout and the degree to which we often rely on religious practices and spiritual beliefs and practices to help us cope with burnout. And, I'm a millennial. I'm a working mom. I have aging parents. I'm a professional. And I am very happy in my job. But I think the public conversations that especially younger workers are having about issues of burnout, about how they think of themselves as workers, but also whether or not they think that organizations have done a good job of supporting them and recognizing them as whole people, and what the responsibilities of organizations and workplaces. I think all of these conversations have been unearthed, and I'm really grateful for the way that this research in particular and this book adds to that conversation.
I do think what you just said about burnout is really important. We have one figure in the book where we show that burnout is especially likely among younger workers, and the ways in which younger workers utilize their religion sometimes to mitigate burnout. Younger workers are also less likely to be involved in religious organizations, and so more likely to experience burnout, less likely to be able to draw on the resources that mitigate it for some people.
Right.
And yet these folks are, like yourself, Rachel, like coming into their own in terms of their own leadership, and are going to be leading these organizations and teaching us all new ways to show up at work in new creative ways. And so I think we're in a time period where people like myself, who are safely middle-aged plus, I think, need to really walk in some humility and be listening to the voices of younger workers, I think, more acutely. And this is something that really changes you about the research, is you get this very special opportunity to listen to big, numbers of demographic groups. Like, it's such a privilege. And I can't imagine another kind of space where I would get that sort of opportunity to talk to large numbers of workers and to just try to understand what they're experiencing, because I know that they're really going to be our future. And so hopefully this work will be of benefit and will start some conversations that we really need as a society to be having.
I hope younger workers also read your book, because as you point out in the book, younger workers not only are going to be the leaders of the workplace in the future, but they're also the ones who are asking directly for more open and nuanced conversations about these issues, about religious pluralism and accommodation in the workplace. They're not as scared, perhaps, as those who have grown up with hearing and internalizing the sense of work and religion need to be completely separate when you come into the workplace. And so I'm really hopeful about changing demographics and a changing workplace, and what possibilities for conversation this can open up. So I'm really grateful that you've written this book that can touch on so many issues and reach so many people. I really do hope that it creates an opportunity to have a different kind of conversation about religion in the workplace.
Thank you, Rachel. We sure hope so, too.
Yeah.
So, thank you.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Religion Unmuted. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe, to rate, and review us wherever you listen. And my special thanks to our guests Chris Scheidel, Denise Daniels, and Elaine Howard-Eklund. Today's show was written by myself and Haley Hemstreet. Our series is produced by 3 Wire Creative. Religion Unmuted is a joint venture of the Boniek Institute and the Religion and Public Life Center at Rice University. I'm Rachel Schneider. Until next time.